go from the sublime, which I've got to say is the racing presentation, to the ridiculous. No, I'm not talking about the art collection, but rather ourselves at National Vietnam Vets. Has anybody here actually been to our museum on Phillip Island? 3 or 4? Oh, well, of course, the 2 ladies here, I know. Thank you, the others. We're actually at a ground zero when it comes to significance and starting what we would like to call a new museum, even though the National Vietnam Vets Museum has been evolving for about 17 years. The museum started, I might say, almost as and on behalf of veterans who have been damaged by the war, either with PTSD or Agent Orange issues or other issues to do with their experiences in the war. And a travelling trailer basically went around to various retreats that veterans had set up around the country, and people started donating bits to it. The trailer ended up in San Remo, just the other side of the Island Bridge, by the founder of the museum, where he retired, hence the location on Phillip Island, which many of you would have thought, why have they got a museum at Phillip Island? Well, that's the reason. And the small collection from that trailer grew into a shed, and the shed grew into a garage, and the garage grew into 3 or 4 rooms, and then eventually moved to its current location, which is a large, we call it the shed, but it's actually 2 aircraft hangars joined together on Phillip Island itself, just right next to the airfield there. Now you might be asking, why is the operations and marketing manager the person coming up to tell us about significance collection? And the reason is that we just don't have the resources to have a curator at the moment. And I am, almost by default, the collections manager at the museum. Fortunately, I do have some experience as a professional historian by trade, if you like, a member of PHA, but also having done a number of exhibitions in my own right, can bring something at least to the table. When I came to the museum in January, it was because the founders of the museum, the veterans and the volunteers there, and by the way, in this museum, virtually everything is a result of donations and volunteer effort. The museum itself was actually built by volunteers. And as a result, there's been a lot of dedication and love around the collection that's grown up. But of course, as the veterans have got older, our oldest veteran volunteer has just retired from the museum aged 81, and our youngest, I think, might be the CEO at 69. He probably wouldn't want me to tell that in public, but there you are. And so here I am in the next generation of keepers of the museum, if you like, where I've had some army experience and I had a brother in Vietnam, but I'm not a veteran. And so there's a number of significant changes going on within the museum at the moment, which is an interesting journey for some of the veterans and the volunteers that have set up this museum. One of the great ethos, one of the great cultural aspects of this museum is that it is indeed called a veterans museum, as distinct from a war museum. Indeed, the veterans see this and develop the museum with the idea that it become a spiritual home of veterans. So you can see immediately when we're talking about significance that once you throw in a spiritual home aspect, suddenly it makes it all very difficult because everything is significant, depending on your perspective, as Meredith said in her introduction. The other thing about the museum, as you can see from this general shot, it's all things large and small. Everything from 16-ton helicopters to 60-ton tanks, bombers under restoration, which is behind the wall at the back, lots of small items from souvenirs, more than nearly 4,000 images, and what I guess you would say would be, in a general sense, bric-a-brac, but very significant bric-a-brac to the veterans and the families that donated them. Now, a significance assessment was conducted before my time in 2009 by Ewan McGillivray, whom many of you may well know. Now, why Ewan was asked to do this assessment rather than someone else, I'm not sure, but I do know that Ewan was involved in the peace movement in the 70s. I don't know if he told that to the museum at the time. But nonetheless, he did have an interest and certainly an interest and certainly an insight into that period of history, which was quite useful. But when he walked into that museum, which wasn't perhaps even as well laid out as you just saw in the previous example, I think Ewan was a bit overwhelmed, as I was when I first arrived, to see this wonderful collection, better ordered than some of the country collections that Meredith showed in her examples, certainly, but nonetheless a bewildering collection of items, eclectic I describe it as here, and diverse. So Ewan, of course, was very circumspect about his assessment because he knew of the spiritual side of these donations within the museum, but at the same time was, I think, privately a little taken aback at the physical issues to do with the way it was displayed and the protection and conservation of some of those materials. And as a result, while the assessment was quite comprehensive, as you'd expect, and I've just shown you the table of contents to give you some idea, the museum was not really ready to act on most of the recommendations. In fact, probably it was a little premature of the museum to conduct a significance assessment at that point, because at that point the veteran volunteers were still managing the collection. It was actually run by a small committee of veterans. There were no, if you like, professional, in a broader sense, professional employees or volunteers engaged in applying, what was it, museological principles, I think Eddie used the term, to the collection. Before I continue, just talk briefly about these items, large and small. I've mentioned 60-tonne tanks versus small objects such as a letter or an image. Being ex-military men, the volunteers there, they like their big toys, you know? And to them this was significant to have a large aircraft or a helicopter or an iconic item such as a Huey. But when you dig down, sometimes, for example, take our Huey helicopter, which actually did serve in Vietnam, but is now in RAAF colours, in Army colours, which it wasn't in Vietnam. And there are many Hueys around. Dandenong RSL has one sitting up on a pole outside the front door. But nonetheless, it's an iconic aircraft from that period in which, and in fact, under our new branding that we're currently investigating, will almost certainly become part of our new contemporary look, which we'll be launching, I hope, later in November. So in items large and small, it was hard to get the veterans, the volunteer veterans' mind away from the big items and down onto the small items, such as an image or a letter home to mum, or a mascot like a small gollywog that was recently donated that was carried by a loving son to Vietnam, a gift from his mother. Okay. So, what is significant? Now, Ewan identified a number of items which he thought were significant. Now, we call ourselves the National Vietnam Veterans Museum. It's a unique museum. There is nothing else like it in the country. The War Memorial has, of course, a Vietnam gallery. We're currently helping the Shrine to develop a small Vietnam heritage collection as part of their new gallery development for the Anzac Centenary. But there's nothing else like this museum in the whole country. But on the one hand, to say something's of national significance as distinct from personal significance, and applying all of these different criteria actually starts to make life rather complicated and challenging when we're trying to catalogue 25,000 items, which we are about to begin, or we've started beginning, right? Now, on the left, you can see these are the actual ballot marbles that were used during national service that were drawn out of the barrel. The barrel itself is in the War Memorial. We have the marbles. So we're negotiating about that. The interesting thing about the marbles is by themselves they're significant. 63,000 people went into the ballot, of which about 19,000 actually served in Vietnam. But the interesting thing to me about the marbles is that I connect it with another piece in our collection, which are the private papers of private NOAC, Private Noack, Errol Wayne Noack, was the first national serviceman killed in Vietnam, and we've had a donation from his family of all of his personal effects. Yet within the museum, although we recognise that these marbles were significant and that Private Noack's personal collection was significant, the way we have displayed them doesn't indicate any sort of significance whatsoever. So we're currently trying to change that. Private Noack's collection, for example, includes letters home to his mother, which the veterans in there, I guess, wouldn't have seen that as particularly significant, as distinct from an iconic Huey, for example. Those attitudes have been changing quite quickly now. On the right, we have a long piece of artwork. This is a piece done by a former veteran, Peter O'Neill. He called it Vietnam a Queer Place. I won't show you some of the detail because it can be disturbing. What you're looking at there is actually the original artwork on display. We've now imaged it, and we're actually replacing it with the image of the artwork. So we actually are stepping forward, recognising that it's significant, and trying to protect the original in a better way. You can see our Huey down the back, but along running this way is another helicopter called a Cobra, which was an attack helicopter. Came in the war later, came to Vietnam in the late 60s or early 70s. This is significant because it's the only one on display in the Southern Hemisphere. So again, you come back to a large item and you think, well, what's the significance of that? Well, that's the reason. In the armoury, and here we have an interesting armoury because we've got some interesting old weapons that would go right back to the Viet Minh days of the 50s, even before the Americans came to Vietnam and ourselves. But I was walking along the other day looking at it and thinking, oh, we have to improve the labelling in this collection, and found an 1897 bayonet from a Snider rifle. I wonder if they cooked pork over a fire or something with this bayonet. So you can find in a collection like this some oddments that have crept into the collection which really shouldn't be there, and we're working to improve the quality of that. But within that armoury, there are some interesting weapons which you won't find in any other collections. For example, there's some crossbows from Montagnards that we were training in Vietnam as part of our training program. Private Noack, I've mentioned before, Errol Wayne Noack from South Australia. He was a tuna fisherman. He was only there for about 6 weeks before he was killed, and he was killed by our own troops. So quite a poignant story, but also an interesting one because he was the poster boy, I guess, for the anti-war movement, and on his I think a memorial of some kind in Adelaide, the anti-war movement had asked the question, why? Whereas his parents saw it slightly differently, gave his life for freedom's cause. But his personal memorabilia I discovered in a compactus the other day, put away in plastic folders. Not anything on display in the actual collection, and yet the most significant thing about Noack's collection is in a compactus, so we're doing something about that as well. And there's all sorts of memorabilia, as you can see on the right, a dog tag, torches. The black thing on the left is a billy club. I think it says something like, secured from the white mice. The white mice were South Vietnamese military policemen and hated by servicemen and civilians alike. I think it was more like souvenired after a bar crawl or something like that. But also as the equivalent of World War I's trench art, as you can see on that boomerang. Some of it, as mentioned in earlier discussions, no provenance whatsoever, because some of this was just handed over when the trailer was going around 17 years ago. No idea where it came from. And trying to do, we can research those particular names, for example, but it hasn't been done yet. I referred down below to the Dennis Gibbons photographic collection, over 2,500 images. He was a war photographer of some note. However, the War Memorial also has a number of his photographs, but not the collection that we have. That's quite a significant collection, and that will be going on exhibition within the museum in the coming months. Okay. And then, as you can see, the museum has a collection of all sorts of bits and pieces. When you look at this, there's nothing perhaps significant about this in itself. On the right-hand lower panel, you'll see two circular objects on the left side of the panel there. They're actually missing in action bracelets. Now, these are remembrance bracelets that were made by the American Missing in Action program, which was involving trying to recover their, I think something like 16,000 or 23,000, some figure like that, of troops that never had no known grave back in Vietnam. We only had 6 of those men, but because of the fraternal relations with the American Veterans Association, they made 6 bracelets for our 6 MIAs as a gesture of solidarity with our own Vietnam veterans movement. And so those 6 bracelets have actually became significant as a result. The remains of our 6 airmen and soldiers have returned to Australia. We've found them all and returned them. And the jewellery boxes in which those bracelets were all kept open until they returned. They've all been closed one by one. And I tried to persuade the CEO that we actually didn't need to have them out anymore. They're just a jewellery box. But I underestimated the significance to him of those jewellery boxes and to veterans of that whole missing in action story that we'd bring our men home. I think that's just about getting towards the end. So when you look down at a collection like this, you can see it's a major challenge to determine not only what's significant, but also where to start. I was making a note as someone was talking earlier that I must get the guides, the 6 guides that we have are all but one are veterans, and walk them around with me and decide what they like and what's significant. Someone had made that comment, Meredith, perhaps. I've made a note here to talk about resources and infrastructure, and because in a museum of this kind, and we have an estimated 25,000 items in the collection, and unfortunately the old cataloguing system was deleted from our computer system by a well-meaning volunteer last year. So we're really starting from scratch all over again, which is not a bad thing in some respects, because we're actually in the process now of establishing 4 brand new galleries. We don't have galleries, it's a mix match of a collection, but we're actually establishing 4 new galleries, and this process is actually helping us to do that. But deciding what's significant now as we discover items in the collection and doing the proper research work means resources that we don't have. When I first arrived in January, we had about 63 volunteers on our books. Phillip Islanders are itinerant folks. When it's wet and cold, they go north to Queensland. And vice versa. So the population comes and goes, and so do our volunteers. As a result of the many volunteers we had on the books, I discovered there were only 2 working on the collection, a librarian, who was a librarian, and one other. Fortunately now we've done a recruiting campaign, and we've brought together 6 new volunteers, all with the skill sets that we need to move the collection forward. But again, we can only afford to have 2 licences for InMagic, because that's all the money we have to buy. So only 2 people can work at any one time on the 2 computers we have, but one's used by the librarian, so we're back to 1 computer, so you get the idea. When volunteers come in for 1 day a week, and some of you in historical societies I know will be immediately sympathetic and empathetic to my statements here, it takes some time to get the show on the road, particularly when you're trying to also establish new galleries, replace legacy display cases, write new labels, do new content, do cataloguing, write policies, clear out the story, and so on and so on. So resources are a major issue for a museum like ours. I was looking with tremendous envy. I was almost turning green in the seat as I was watching, of course, the Fabulous Racing collection, and the resources that they have by comparison to ourselves, where we get no government support whatsoever. It's all done by people through the front door and donations. So resources is a major issue in terms of moving it forward, but fortunately, Ewan's significance assessment has actually given us, 4 years later, actually some good help, because the recommendations and findings that Ewan was able to make at that time, although largely put aside because of those very lack of resources, money and skill sets that I've referred to change them, are still with us, and we've identified them through this significance assessment without having to do it again. So that's very useful. Partly also the culture, which I've inferred on a couple of occasions of, well, we've been collecting this stuff for 17 years. We know what's important and what's not. Thanks for your professional advice, but actually that's all right. We'll just move on and keep going. Well, I think there's been a bit of a change in attitudes and understanding of what's significant since that time. Some important misunderstandings by volunteers of what constituted significance. And on the other hand, for me, coming in fresh to the collection, perhaps underestimating, on the other hand, is the personal and spiritual significance of some of the items that have been donated by volunteers. That many have been donated, many of the donors being known personally, of course, by the volunteers who founded the museum. From beginning of this year, and in fact one of the reasons why I'm now at the museum, we're now an independent museum. Previously we were under the auspices of a veterans association, particularly concerned with veterans welfare. We're now an independent museum, and so we're taking, I'd say, big steps towards professionalising the museum. We're entering, with luck, in August 20 after our inspection. You've got something to do with that, haven't you? The museum accreditation program. So we're actually starting to move forward to move the museum up to a proper level of museum standards, but also looking forward to the future. We're about to embark on a major master plan study with a very large grant from Regional Development Victoria, which will take the planning for the museum out to 2025. In fact, sitting out the back of our museum on pallets is our new museum. Donated very generously by T. Stegremont as it decommissioned the, I can't say white elephant desal plant at Wonthaggi, but I just did. The desal plant at Wonthaggi, we've managed to acquire virtually a brand new building, and we're now just negotiating now to acquire more land. So we have big plans for our museum. We certainly want to move it back to move it up to become a truly national museum, and we're looking at the longer term in terms of how it will evolve into the future. There's certainly much to be done, and another significance assessment will no doubt be done within a couple of years, because as we're shifting through the collection, creating new galleries, taking things off the floor and putting them into temporary storage. I say that because I know it's probably going to be longer than temporary, but there you are. We'll do another significance assessment, and I think the work done in 2009, while perhaps not fully appreciated at the time, has certainly given us a tremendous basis for moving forward. I'll just give you one last thought, that we have something like, I think I counted 64 uniforms alone out on the floor, sitting on mannequins in the open air, or hanging on racks. About 15 maybe are in display cases. So I've started a process of actually removing them from the floor to try and preserve them, and catalogue them. It's taken 2 of my volunteers 2 weeks to do 10. And we've still got 24,990 items to go. Good luck with that. So the original assessment, although dated, still provides a good framework from which to assess donated items, and as we go through our cataloguing process and our MAP program, I'm very confident that we'll certainly not only better protect and present our current items, which we believe are significant, but also discover new ones and look after them on the floor as well. And last but not least is our Cyclo. It's one of the better pictures I have. What's significant about this? It's actually got Century something Hotel, Ho Chi Minh City. So it's definitely not from the Vietnam era and probably was built afterwards, but as a symbol of what our men would have ridden around in, and I've ridden myself around in Ho Chi Minh City. In those days, it's an enduring symbol of Vietnam, and it's actually, I'm moving it right to the entrance, so that'll be the first thing people see as they come in. But again, we have some nice items, but not necessarily significant. And this is the challenge that we face into the future. End of slideshow.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Neil Sharkey from the Shrine Ange, we've met before.
Yes, we have. Yeah.
Hi. I'm very interested in, you alluded to it before at the beginning of your talk, that your museum is not a war museum, it's a veterans museum, and it's been made, it's come about because of the commitment and the love and the enthusiasm of the volunteers and the veterans themselves. And you also alluded to the ageing, the fact that these men and women are ageing.
Yes.
Is there any concern?
Actually, they're not the only ones that are ageing.
No, quite right. As are we all. But what's the thinking that's going in, as far as the volunteers are concerned, as they fall away, and there are no veterans left?
Yes.
Is it the general wish for people for it to continue as a museum and as a record of the way the veterans themselves felt about the war and their involvement in it? Or is there at some point a recognition that perhaps maybe the way to go is to turn it from a veterans museum into a war museum? And that being the case, is there a recognition among these men and women that that significance may be,
yes.
Their successes, notions of significance may differ very widely from their own? Or is there some way to preserve what they believe is significant for all time?
The first thing is in moving to become an independent museum, there's been some recognition, not necessarily an epiphany, but a growing realisation that in years to come there won't be any veterans to physically look after that museum, let alone continue the process. Hence my arrival and some other people coming on board now at the museum. So they're very concerned now about the legacy that they leave. But they also feel very strongly that it's a veterans experience museum. We've actually just broadened the mission statement out to include the impact of the war on society, not just on the veterans. So I've done a little bit of bracket creep with the mission statement to allow us to broaden out to do things like the peace movement, for example, which is not addressed properly in this museum. However, the idea that the master plan study will address some of these issues that you've just raised. In particular, is it a war museum? Is it sustainable under its current theming? And is it sustainable at Phillip Island even, for that matter? Yesterday I was at a seminar for welcoming Chinese visitors to Phillip Island, of all things. And another attraction further down the road gets 150,000 Chinese tourists a year. So there's plenty of people coming onto Phillip Island, let alone Chinese tourists. So it's a question of modernising and making more contemporary the appeal of this museum past the veteran community per se. We still absolutely put the veterans front and centre in terms of it's their community museum, that they're the community that began it, but we are now looking at the future and saying, well, how can we evolve? When I first arrived, there was some talk about, oh, let's bring the peacekeepers here. They need a home. We'll develop a military history precinct. But the peacekeepers haven't got anything to do with Vietnam. It's actually the period before Vietnam, which leads up to the war and how we got to be there in the first place, which is perhaps more important. So we are thinking about these things already. The master plan will certainly address some of these issues. The veteran founders are certainly concerned about their legacy and where the museum will go. The CEO said to me, well, Andrew, I brought you in to make change. I'm not comfortable with it, but I have to get used to it. So we are making a lot of changes, and I think that the veterans are seeing that they're good, positive changes for the museum, and that with new branding, new website, new technology that we're introducing, new exhibitions, new galleries, everything, we're making so many changes. Simultaneously, come and have a look at our museum in another year, and you'll think, well, this really is a museum.
Thank you very much.